Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session on HMRC enforcement. We're very pleased that you've been able to join us, and we hope you and your families are well in these difficult times. This session is one of a series of interactive webinars hosted by Fieldfisher's Employment, Pensions, Immigration and Compliance team, also known as EPIC. We are hosting a 30-minute session every Tuesday at 1 p.m, covering significant legal developments and hot topics, and offering practical advice for businesses and organisations in this ever-changing environment. Let me start by introducing you to your speakers. My name is Hannah Disselbeck. I'm an associate in the employment team in London. I'm joined today by my colleague Matt Sharp, who is a senior associate in Fieldfisher's Tax Disputes and Investigations team. You will see the agenda for today's session up on your screens now. We will start with a brief canter through the cornerstones of the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, although we appreciate it will be quite familiar to most of you. I'll keep this quite high level. The purpose of this session isn't to go through the rules of the scheme in any detail. I will also take this opportunity to briefly touch on the Chancellor's announcement on Friday evening on the future of furlough. Matt will then give an introduction to Pay Now, Check Later, and HMRC's approach to enforcement and the penalty regime. We would then like to briefly hand over to you. Are you using the furlough scheme? And how worried are you about HMRC enforcement? We'll take a brief poll to get a sense of people's feelings about CJRS compliance. Matt will then speak to you about mitigating the risks of HMRC enforcement action. And as many furlough schemes have had to be implemented very quickly, auditing arrangements can provide important protection. So we'll wrap up by introducing you to our new compliance audit. If you have any questions, please use the question box in your control panel on the right-hand side of the screen. We will aim to get through as many as possible, but if we do not get time to answer all the questions, your usual Fieldfisher contacts will follow up with you individually after the session. All our sessions are recorded and available on the Fieldfisher website and YouTube channel. Right, with the housekeeping out of the way, let's get started with a brief overview of the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. As I said, I expect most of you will be intimately familiar with it by now. The CJRS, or furlough scheme, was introduced by the government at an early point in the lockdown. Its aim, as you know, was to provide emergency assistance to the businesses impacted by the pandemic and to avoid mass redundancies in hardest hit sectors such as retail, travel and hospitality, among others. At a high level then, the scheme allows employers to agree with employees that they will take furlough leave for minimum periods of 3 weeks. During furlough, the government supports employers by offering a grant that covers 80% of furloughed employees' wage costs up to a monthly cap of £2,500. The government also reimburses the mandatory employer pension contributions and employer NICs payable on the wages covered by the grant monies. Currently, it's a core rule of the scheme that employees cannot work for their employer during furlough. That's known as the no work rule, and that's something that Matt will cover in a little bit more detail later. The furlough scheme is administered by HMRC, who have issued quite detailed guidance for employers and employees. As you will know if you've used it, employers periodically calculate the amounts to which they're entitled and submit claims through an HMRC portal. There are detailed rules around eligibility and around the calculation of grant monies, but I won't go into those further here. The scheme covered initial claim periods from the 1st of March, and it'll run in its current form until the 30th of June. Now, you may have seen Chancellor Rishi Sunak's announcement on Friday evening about the future of the scheme, and there's been quite a bit of press coverage over the weekend. I'm just going to briefly touch on the headline points here. The key thing to be aware of in planning terms is that the scheme will close to new entrants on the 30th of June. Now, what does that mean? It means that the last date on which you can place someone on furlough for the first time is actually the 10th of June. That's because employees must be furloughed for a minimum of 3 weeks at a time, and you'll need to make a first claim for newly furloughed employees, covering at least that 3-week period, on the 30th of June. So working backwards, that takes you to the 10th of June, by which point you should have placed anybody new on furlough. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't place anyone on furlough after the 30th of June or indeed after the 10th of June, but it does mean that you won't be able to place anyone on furlough for the first time after that key date, the 10th of June. Employers who are rotating shifts in and out of furlough, and we've seen a good bit of that, will need to plan their arrangements carefully around the 10th of June date. Just taking a quick look at the other new things coming out of the Chancellor's announcement, from the 1st of July, employers will be able to use the scheme more flexibly to support short working arrangements. You'll need to bear the full cost of hours worked, but you will continue to be able to take advantage of the subsidy for non-working periods. For employees who remain furloughed full-time, the full government subsidy will remain available. From August to October, the subsidy will slowly be tapered down. Taking a quick look at that, in August, the full 80% subsidy subject to the cap will remain available, but employers will need to bear the full cost of employer pension contributions and employer NICs on those amounts. The wage subsidy itself will be reduced to 70% in September and then down to 60% in October. Caps will continue to apply. They'll be prorated down from that 2,500 amount that we're using currently. During these months, employers will need to bear the cost of topping furloughed employees' wages up to the 80% or £2,500 level, so that furloughed employees' position isn't affected by the tapering off of the subsidy. The scheme will close completely on the 31st of October. We expect there will be more detailed guidance on the operation of the scheme going forward on the 12th of June. So please do reach out to us if you need any advice on transitioning out of furlough. For now, we'll be focusing on the scheme in its current form, though what Matt will say will be equally relevant going forward. And in fact, as the scheme rules become more complicated with short-term working and tapering subsidies, you will need to be more and more careful not to foot fault and risk HMRC penalties. I'm going to hand over to Matt now, but before I do, perhaps just one quick closing remark. Many employers have had to act very quickly to implement furlough programs to ensure business continuity. Employers' lives have been made quite difficult from the start by the fact that HMRC guidance hasn't always been quite clear and consistent. There have always been gaps. And HMRC has issued clarifying guidance in multiple instalments to plug those gaps throughout the life of the scheme and is continuing to do so. Some employers have therefore faced the problem that the goalposts, which were initially not all that much more than lines in the sand, have now solidified and shifted a bit, so employers have had to shift with them. Right, I'm now going to hand over to Matt, who will talk a bit about HMRC enforcement.
Thanks, Hannah. So, what do we know about HMRC enforcement? In truth, very little. Due to the speed with which the furlough scheme was introduced, very little, if any, thought has been given as to how enforcement will operate. You'll see on screen now the sole provision of the Coronavirus Act 2020 dealing with enforcement, and that basically provides that HMRC have such functions as they need in order to enforce compliance with the furlough scheme. And then as for HMRC guidance on enforcement, well, that's also equally brief. HMRC has said that it is operating a scheme of pay first, check later. It has also said, as you will see on screen, that it will seek the return of dishonest claims and also inaccurate claims. Now, this wording closely mirrors HMRC's existing enforcement powers for tax errors. Indeed, the general consensus is that HMRC's current rules will be applied. So let's take a look at those existing rules and how they might be applied to the furlough scheme. So HMRC's existing rules classify errors in three ways, and those are on screen now. So the three are innocent errors, careless errors, and deliberate issues. So taking each of those in turn, innocent is where a taxpayer took reasonable care to get things right, but still made a mistake. And when we're talking about reasonable care, HMRC guidance states if you aren't sure about anything, you should ask HMRC or a tax advisor. Moving on to careless errors. These are non-deliberate errors, and the test that HMRC applies is akin to negligence. In other words, falling below the standards you would expect from a reasonable taxpayer. Finally, there is deliberate conduct. This is essentially dishonest conduct or fraud. So then, just applying these to the furlough scheme, what kind of examples could we give? Well, for an innocent error, it could be a furlough payment calculation error that was made despite taking advice. In terms of a careless error, this might be the same kind of thing, a furlough payment calculation error, but where no advice was taken. And in terms of a deliberate issue, well, this might be requiring all that Hannah talked about. And it's just worth briefly mentioning there that HMRC has set up a whistleblowing hotline to deal with this kind of deliberate conduct for employees to effectively report employers who have been actively encouraging them to work in breach of this no work rule. And I think it was reported in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago that there's already been about 800 reports which HMRC is starting to investigate. So let's follow that through. You'll see again on the screen those three categories, the innocent, careless, and deliberate. So in all of those circumstances, HMRC will seek the repayment of the sums overclaimed. But in addition, assuming the existing HMRC rules on enforcement apply, we would expect no penalties for innocent cases, penalties of up to 30% for careless errors, and penalties of up to 100% for deliberate issues. Now we've done some very rough maths for someone receiving the maximum furlough payment, that 2,500 cap that Hannah talked about, and assuming that an individual is on furlough for a 5-month period, this means that for a careless error, the maximum penalty would be £4,225 per employee, and for a deliberate issue, the maximum penalty would be about £14,000 per employee. And obviously that is the kind of level that HMRC would be seeking, and that's obviously in addition to the return of the erroneous furlough payment. So for a deliberate issue where the penalty is up to 100%, you could be seeing that 14,000 penalty as well as the 14,000 reclamation of the monies paid to date. So quite substantial numbers. And then finally, for deliberate errors, there is also the risk of criminal investigation, and HMRC has said that it will look at fraud prosecutions for those who are deliberately abusing the system. And we should expect quite a tough stance on those kind of cases. So then moving on, let's get some feedback on your experiences of the furlough scheme. So this is our quick poll feature, and we'd ask that you please select one of the 4 answers on screen. The question is, what percentage of your workforce has been furloughed? And it's really useful to think about this when planning for the risk of HMRC enforcement. Using what we've told you about penalties, it's worth thinking about what your maximum exposure is in the event that there are errors. Knowing this will of course allow you to put into perspective the risk of challenge and what steps would be proportionate and cost effective to take to avoid a challenge. So just give you a couple of seconds and then we will get to the results. So if we've got the results, there we go. So the vast majority have furloughed less than 25% of their workforce, which is great in terms of thinking about the scope of those potential penalties and the potential reclaimed CGRS payments. So yeah, very interesting. Moving on to the next question. So the next one is, did you take advice on the CJRS scheme? So this is a really important point. As mentioned, being able to demonstrate to HMRC that you took advice is so helpful to argue that errors are innocent as opposed to careless. So did you take advice from your accountant, your lawyer, or not at all? So focusing here on implementation. So give you a couple of seconds and have a look at the results. Brilliant, let's take a look. That's really good to see. So the vast majority taking into account the accountant and the lawyer advice. So approximately, what's that, about 75% took advice, which is fantastic to see. And that will be really helpful if HMRC later come along and challenge. We can point to that as demonstrating reasonable care to push towards that innocent bracket as opposed to the careless bracket. And then final question. So keeping in mind the constantly evolving guidance, how confident are you that there are no CJRS errors in your implementation of the furlough scheme? Very confident, neutral, or concerned? Again, I guess just give you a few seconds to put the votes in. See if we have the results. That, again, really good to see. So the majority are either neutral or confident, no errors. And I think that 24% concerned about errors is entirely understandable. As Hannah said, the guidance has been completely evolving and moving, so it's entirely understandable that there would be some concerns about the errors. So thanks, that's really helpful. So then moving on to our top tips for avoiding disputes with HMRC on furlough payments. So these are our 3 top tips. Number 1 is to keep up to date with and follow the latest HMRC and government guidance. Number of different sources for this. So the Fieldfisher website has a dedicated page where we comment on all of the legal issues. HMRC's website and also gov.uk, all great sources for keeping up to date. Second top tip is keep records. So for example, in relation to furlough agreements, HMRC says this must be kept for a minimum of 5 years. We would encourage you to stretch that a bit longer to at least 7. So the key thing here is think about what documents you need to keep. So when we're auditing clients for furlough scheme compliance, we look at things like, have you recorded in writing the impact on your business of coronavirus and why furlough was necessary to avoid redundancies, and having this to hand in the event that HMRC come along, it is so important. So can't stress enough the importance of keeping records. And then the final top tip is undertaking audits and checks for furlough scheme compliance. So just looking at that in a bit more detail. So making a claim is not the end of the road. Looking back and reviewing claims already made and the circumstances leading to those claims can provide you with a valuable insight and protection. Not only will an audit help you avoid repeating past issues, but also it will help you to demonstrate reasonable care if HMRC do later come along. We've included on screen some of the areas we look at when we do furlough audits to give you an idea of what you can and should be looking at in terms of that audit. Hannah, I think we've got a few minutes just to take a look at those in a bit more detail.
Indeed, thank you, Matt. As Matt said, the purpose of the CJRS audit is really twofold. Firstly, it provides you with some protection if HMRC do audit you. Frankly, it'll also just give you some peace of mind in the meantime for that 24% that are concerned currently about CJRS compliance. Secondly, it can help you to identify issues and start working through them. Now that's true in terms of CJRS compliance, but also in terms of other potential problem areas. So taking a quick look at the areas that we have up on screen there. First, you'll see at the top we would look at CJRS qualification requirements. Now, in terms of qualification requirements for businesses, they've been, I think, consciously quite vague from the start because the government's appreciated that businesses will be affected in very different ways by coronavirus. So it is quite important to think through why using the furlough scheme was and is appropriate for your business, but it's not terribly prescriptive there. But then in terms of the eligibility of individual employees, that is more prescriptive, and there have been more detailed rules from the start. So that's something that we would look at quite closely in a CJRS compliance audit. One important angle, the next point from an employment and equalities law perspective, is to look at how you select individuals for furlough. and to test whether your furlough program might have disproportionately impacted individuals sharing a particular protected characteristic, and might potentially be indirectly or even directly discriminatory. Now, identifying these risks early may not be an instant fix, but it will give you an opportunity to manage any risk proactively. Then looking at the next point, the furlough agreement is a very good example of where different considerations play in from a CJRS compliance angle, but then also from an employment law angle. So to comply with CJRS requirements, all you really need is a document that evidences your agreement with individuals that they'll be furloughed. That can be a collective agreement, and that's all really from a furlough perspective. From an employment law point of view, though, you might well want your furlough agreement to cover off a number of other areas. This is, after all, a variation of contract in the same way as you would vary a contract for a sabbatical or other unpaid leave. So you might want to deal with issues such as benefits, sick leave, holiday, and very importantly, how you want to manage the end of furlough. Sort of skipping around the wheel a bit, you'll see that there are points around pension and immigration law. Those again are key areas, and we work quite closely with our colleagues in the pensions team and in immigration when we carry out these audits. And they feed into our assessment of the other points. For example, immigration law issues will feed into our assessment of how a selection process was carried out. Pension issues, on the other hand, will feed into how we look at a furlough agreement and the computation of the furlough payment. So it really is a cross-disciplinary approach you have to take here. Right, in that case, I think we have time for a few questions. Thank you for listening to us talk. And I see we have had a couple in. So shall I start? I think this one's for you, Matt. On the HMRC penalty, would that be a percentage of the furlough payment made in each pay period?
Yeah, so really good question. Effectively, the penalty in the tax concept and likely to be applied here as well, it's a percentage of the monies that HMRC seek back. So if HMRC sought 2,500 back for a given month, they would also, if they're applying 100% penalty, seek to levy a 2,500 penalty on top. So we talk about that in terms of it being a tax gear penalty, i.e. a percentage of tax, but equally here it's a percentage of the furlough payment. So it's all about that 30% or 100% of whatever the sum is that HMRC are seeking back.
Great, thank you, Matt. I think we've got another one for you. What's HMRC's approach if we've relied on an early iteration of the guidance, but some element of the guidance has changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's so tough when we appreciate on the ground, it's incredibly hard with HMRC updating guidance constantly to keep on top of that. And where I think this comes in is that obviously those different categories of innocent and careless, as long as you're keeping on top of the guidance, I don't think anyone could say that you've ever been careless as a result of missing something in the updated guidance. I mean, HMRC has stressed that it will still pursue inaccurate claims, so those innocent claims. So I don't think that would missing an update would be a complete defense, but it's very important when it comes to that distinction between is this an innocent or a careless issue, and being able to demonstrate that you're keeping on top of the guidance is incredibly important.
Great. I think the next one is probably one more for me. Any specific steps required to bring people back to work from furlough? That's a really good question. Ideally, you would have a provision in your furlough agreement that covers this off and that says, for example, your furlough leave will end on the earliest of us giving you a week's notice, or the scheme closing, or you ceasing to be eligible for the scheme. Even if you don't have that in there, we would take the view that you can bring furlough to a close just by giving reasonable notice. You would need to think through the sort of wider implications of that, because if you're also seeking a return into a physical workplace, there are obviously a lot of health and safety considerations around that you'll also need to take into account. Great. Another one for, well, either of us, I suppose, but what is the definition of a new entrant to the CJRS, the organisation or an individual? That's a great question. It would in the end, it would boil out down to both. Really, it's an individual, but by definition, if you have an organisation that hasn't furloughed people previously, then they would also not be able to start furloughing after that cut-off date. Let me just have a look at the list. Matt, I think another one for you. If we conduct an internal audit, as you suggest, who is an appropriate owner for that within the organisation?
Thanks. So I suppose with the furlough scheme, I expect that you've got multiple stakeholders involved: HR, legal, finance, business managers, and this is one of the reasons that audit is quite important, because obviously communication between those very different groups within a business can mean that the issues crop up along the way, and that the sooner we can identify those and correct those mean that there's no future issues, but also it's demonstrating that reasonable care if HMRC do later come along. In terms of who should take ownership of it, my slight preference, if there's an internal legal function, would be the internal legal, because that would help in terms of preserving privilege if they're working with external advisors. But I think it's important to involve all of those who have been involved in the implementation of the furlough scheme to make sure that everyone helps pick up these issues that might have cropped up along the way.
Great, thanks, Matt. I think here's another one I can take a stab at. If we had someone off and on furlough, is each 3-week period a new furlough? So does the date of 10th June apply for these people too? Yeah, I think this goes to the point of rotating shifts of people on and off furlough, which we've seen quite a lot of, to mostly to address some potential selection issues with who should go on and off furlough. The answer is no, this date of 10th June wouldn't apply to bar you from putting people on furlough if they've already been on furlough and come off furlough. So as long as they're in the system, so to speak, you're fine, and you can put them back on furlough, taking any changes to the rules into account after that 30th of June cutoff. Right, I think we possibly have time for just one more. This is an interesting one. What if an employee has been contacting clients and essentially working without our knowledge? Yeah, that's that's an issue which I expect might come up in a sort of professional services world where you have employees with direct client contact. It's a bit of a difficult one because ideally you'll have even a relatively basic furlough agreement will state very clearly that individuals can't work. You'll also have issued an instruction, presumably, to say you may not work during furlough. So if somebody does defy that and work during furlough, then that's both a breach of contract and a failure to follow a reasonable management instruction. So technically, you could discipline them. Frankly, in the vast majority of cases, that's relatively unlikely to be an appropriate step, but you would have to consider it on a case-by-case basis. One other thing to check is whether your furlough agreement would allow you to claw back any payments made to a furloughed individual that you have to return to HMRC because of that individual's failure. Matt, is there anything you'd add to that from a sort of HMRC enforcement perspective?
Yeah, I think just from what we have heard from HMRC and their guidance, I wouldn't expect that the fact of an employee going against employer guidance and still working would provide a complete defence to HMRC seeking back those payments that have been made. But what it will go to is effectively whether that's an innocent or careless issue. So as Hannah was talking about, if you've taken all possible steps, thinking about shutting off email access and things like that to stop your employees from working when they're on furlough, and making clear your expectations of them, that could never, I would suggest, be considered a careless problem. It would be more of an innocent problem. Obviously, we'll keep an eye on that as the guidance comes along, because it does seem particularly unfair that an employer could be penalised effectively for the employee's actions.
Great, thank you, Matt. I'm sorry, I think that's probably all we have time for in terms of questions. Thank you everyone very much for joining today's session on HMRC enforcement. We hope you found it useful. As I mentioned at the beginning, all our sessions are recorded and can be found on our website and on the Fieldfisher YouTube channel. I'm sorry if we haven't got to your questions. If you had questions which we weren't able to answer, your usual Fieldfisher contacts will follow up with you individually. If you would like to discuss this topic further, we'd be delighted to talk to you more about it. Please do get in touch with either Matt or myself or your usual Fieldfisher contacts who'll be able to help you. Do keep safe, and we hope you can join us next week for a session on testing, tracing, and targeted monitoring, dealing with employee privacy issues in the new world. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.